welcome to everybody for coming down to the panel today. We've got a really exciting topic that I think is on top of people's minds, given some of the things that are happening in our global context. So given the timing, I'm going to go straight into our first speaker. Many of you will recognize him from his columns in major newspapers, Dr. Salim Mansur, who is joining us from London, Ontario. So thank you for coming all this way. He's an associate professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Western Ontario in London, and he teaches in the Department of Political Science. He was born in Calcutta and moved to Canada, where he completed his studies, receiving a doctorate in political science from the University of Toronto. Before joining the University of Western Ontario, he worked as a research fellow at the Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security in Ottawa. Dr. Mansur is a senior distinguished fellow with the Gatestone Institute in New York, a member of the board of directors of Policy, also based in Washington, D.C., and an academic consultant with the Center for Security Policy. He's a member of the advisory board for the Center for Immigration Policy Reform in Ottawa, vice president for the Council of Muslims Facing Tomorrow, based in Toronto, and vice president for Canadians Against Suicide Bombing. Pretty busy guy. His book, Delectable Lie, was awarded in 2014 the Montaigne Medal by the Eric Hoffer Book Award in the United States for the most thought-provoking title of the year. Dr. Mansur was presented in February 2015 with the Peace, Order, and Good Government Canadian Values Award in Ottawa, and in September 2006 with the American Jewish Congress Stephen S. Wise Profiles in Courage Award in Los Angeles, United States. So we're very pleased to have such a distinguished scholar with us to talk to us about this issue, and I will invite him up on the stage now. Dr. Mansur?
Do I need to keep this open? Is there? Okay, I'll close it then.
No, not all the way.
Pardon me?
That's good.
I put it back up?
That's fine. Where it is.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers, to Anish Newman, for inviting me to come to this event in Calgary. It's a pleasure to be here. Happy to engage with you, and I look forward to the discussion that we might have this afternoon. Well, the subject that I was told to talk about, that we are addressing, is titled Radicalization, a Global Crisis, National Challenge, and Local Impact. It's a mouthful. But to begin, let us parse this title, for herein, I suggest, is a problem that needs to be sorted out, even before we know what we are addressing. What is meant by radicalization, we may ask, especially when this unqualified notion of radicalization is referred to both as a global crisis and a national challenge, presumably for Canada, since we are having this event take place in Canada, and that this radicalization is also locally consequential, for it likely threatens the good citizens of Calgary. Since radicalization has been left undefined, unqualified, or perhaps there is hesitation on the part of the Global Fest organizers to define what is meant by radicalization, we are left guessing what sort of beast this radicalization is that, in posing as a global crisis, morphs into a national challenge and then threatens the peace and security of people locally in the towns and villages where they reside. Now, I might throw up my hands and say, I have no clue. And if I were to guess, that here radicalization could possibly mean, since we are in Calgary and the good people of Alberta have recently made history by electing an NDP government, that a significant segment of Albertans have become radicalized against the production of what a good friend from Calgary, the broadcaster and author Ezra Levant, has described as ethical oil, and they want to bankrupt the Albertan oil industry to save a planet from effects of burning fossil fuel, and that this radicalization as a result is a crisis of global dimension and poses a national challenge with local impact right here in Calgary, I do not think I would be in error in making such an assumption. But then I would not have been invited to this gathering, because I don't have any expertise on that particular aspect of radicalization. And I would not be sharing this platform this afternoon with an officer from the Calgary Police Services. Obviously, radicalization does not mean our present discussion, the politics of voting NDP or bankrupting the production of ethical oil. So we have a problem here that precedes the problem we want to address. In other words, the problem of radicalization that is left undefined. And we are reluctant to define it, to name the problem. Then we can neither understand nor explain it. So the first problem, the reluctance to define or qualify radicalization, arises from the social norm of political correctness we have put in place. The invisible safeguards we have erected around us so that we do not utter in words what we may think inside our heads in fear of offending people that might make us then appear as bigots or worse. Consequently, we drift in the direction of speaking increasingly in euphemisms, and our unwillingness to plainly and clearly confront unpleasant facts obscures issues we want to address. Now, a few weeks ago, the Senate Committee on National Security and Defense in Ottawa released to the public, quote, "Countering the Terrorist Threat in Canada, an interim report." Since we are in the midst of a federal election, Canadians should take at least a quick read of this interim report to make up their minds on the subject it addresses, which I believe should be of concern to all of us. But again, as with the phrasing of the topic of this afternoon's discussion, the Senate committee leaves the term, quote, "terrorist," unqualified, even as it goes out of its way in terms of the time, effort, and cost involved to let Canadians know that they need to, quote, "counter terrorist threat," unquote. Now, how are we to understand the nature of this terrorist threat if we do not know who are the terrorists? Is the terrorist threat emanating from vegetarians, or the Roma gypsies, or the Tibetan followers of the Dalai Lama? Obviously not. But here we have another illustration of how our good senators are adept in politically correct speech. And so the terrorist threat goes undefined as it is left to Canadians to figure out who are the terrorists. And while I am still referring to the Senate report, let me point out that the authors of this report, the good senators, note at the outset that despite a shared, quote, "belief in the importance of protecting Canadians against threats of terrorism," unquote, the Senate committee lacked consensus. And 3 senators dissented from the report. Our difficulties resulting from political correctness is no less consequential, I suggest, than those arising from problems that might cause us injury or death. So I will put aside political correctness, and I'll ask you all to put aside political correctness and name the problem we want to talk about this afternoon, and which has become a global crisis threatening us. This problem resides within a religion or faith tradition, Islam, and with its followers, or a segment of its followers, Muslims, who have declared war, jihad, against those who do not share their politics, irrespective of whether they are Muslims or non-Muslims. This war, or jihad, in turning global, threatens the West, including Canada. In other words, the radicalization we refer to is about the use or abuse of religion, of how a segment of radical or extremists or militant Muslims have turned Islam into an ideology, hence Islamism, for justifying their violence, their terrorism against those deemed as enemy. This violence, or jihad, in the name of Islam, perpetrated by Muslim extremists and indiscriminately directed against civilian population, is called the Muslim terrorist threat that the senators have sought to address without qualifying the threat as Muslim or Islamist in the report. So the problem of radicalization we are concerned with since at least 11 September 2001 emanates from the Muslim world, involves a segment of the Muslim population, and is a symptom of what might be termed, as in the words of Franco-Tunisian Muslim philosopher Abdul Wahab Madhab, the malady of Islam, or, quote, the crisis of Islam, as in the title of a book by Bernard Lewis, the foremost historians of Arabs and Muslims and Islamic civilization in the West. It is first and most importantly a Muslim problem. And given the failure of the Muslim world to deal with the problem, it has morphed into a global problem of immense complexity. And frankly, there is no quick or simple solution of the problem at hand. In the Senate report on countering terrorist threat, we find a list of 25 recommendations for the Parliament and the Government of Canada to consider. These range from making criminal offense for any Canadian to be a member of a known terrorist group, monitoring suspects, surveillance of internet traffic, giving more effective tools to our security agencies for interdiction and prosecution, tracking the flow of offshore money, and proactive engagement within Muslim communities to assist in spreading an effective counter-narrative to the radical ideology. There are other recommendations, such as to make travel to terrorist hotspots criminal offense, to remove charitable status from organizations that have provided material support to terrorist groups, to investigate options available of training and certification of imams in Canada, and to publishing a wanted terrorist list of those Canadians for whom a warrant, national or international, has been issued on grounds of terrorist-related activities. The effort of the Senate committee is positive, and also that of the government in contending with the problem. There are also legitimate concerns that in responding to the terrorist threat, the bedrock principles of liberal democracy are not undermined, and that Canada remains an open and free society. These Senate recommendations and other similar efforts since 9/11 are directed at dealing with what I call the symptoms of the problem. Yet, however effective we are as a people in dealing with the symptoms of the terrorist threat in our midst, their cause, the malady of Islam, is not going away. We need to understand something of the cause of this malady, of how and why it has come about, even though it might very well be beyond our immediate or long-term capacity to cure it, since ultimately the cure has to come from within the Muslim world. The malady is embedded in the historic failure of the Islamic or Muslim civilization to make the transition from the pre-modern to the modern world, which means a shift in worldview from the closed world of the medieval age to the open universe of the post-medieval modern age. Samuel Huntington of Harvard University wrote famously about the clash of civilizations. but there is the more horrendous clash of worldviews among Muslims, which has metastasized into a pre-medieval barbaric civil war inside Islam. We are witnessing as the absolutely grotesque savagery of ISIS. While those Muslims, a majority, I believe, in the Muslim world, appalled by this savagery in the name of Islam and wanting to see ISIS militarily crushed and eliminated, are bewildered, confused, and unable to mount an effective campaign against extremist Muslims or Islamists in their midst. The Muslim world is greatly divided within, even as it is geographically extensive and ethnoculturally vastly diverse. The world of Islam extends from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean in Morocco to the islands of the Indonesian archipelago in the Pacific Ocean. From the deserts of Central Asia to the vast subcontinent of India or South Asia. From the rim of China to sub-Saharan Africa. Any description of this vast area as the Muslim world with a population of some 1.7 billion Muslims and rapidly increasing given the fertility rate suggests neither political unity nor cultural conformity among Muslims as a people. It only means that the common thread by which this portion of the earth may be defined as the Muslim world is the commonly shared belief of a majority of people or of the population in Islam, and that this shared belief has provided a sense of belonging to what was once, centuries ago, a significantly vibrant Islamic civilization. This extensive and diverse Muslim world, however, is entirely located in what was until recently described as the Third World, in contrast to the First World of North America and Western Europe, and the Second World of the communist countries headed by the former Soviet Union. The essential characteristic of the Third World, in comparison to the First and Second World, was found in its industrial, technological, and scientific backwardness. At the beginning of the 21st century and the third millennium, the extent of the Muslim world's failure to make the transition into the industrial and scientific age of the modern world has been documented extensively in various cross-country data of the United Nations, the World Bank, and other organizations devoted to such studies. All of these various studies can be summarized in one striking datum. The Muslim population is just under 1/4 of the global population, roughly about 23%, while the gross domestic product, the GDP, of the Muslim world as a measure of its economy is less than 1/10, around about 8% of the world GDP. What such numbers indicate are the poverty and general backwardness of the Muslim world in comparative terms, and that the gap between the countries of the Islamic civilization on the one hand and the advanced industrial civilization of the West has widened immensely over time, and especially over the past 100 years. For Muslims, in general, the reality of the civilizational backwardness compared to the dynamism of the West is humiliating, especially for those who have done some studies, who are engaged in society, the middle class and the upper class. It is humiliating. This is doubly humiliating to many Muslims when comparison is made between Muslim societies and non-Muslim, non-Western societies, such as India and Israel, that are more or less successful in making the transition from the pre-modern world to the modern world of science and democracy. Now, why is this so? In part, the answer is psychological. the sense Muslims have of the fall from status of power, prestige, and privilege their civilization once held, and hence the memory of the past that grates upon the present. Then there's the belief that as Muslims, the religion, Islam, teaches submission to God as the path to success, both in the present and in the hereafter. The confusion or bewilderment of Muslims, therefore, arises from the disparity, on the one hand, between their faith in Islam, the devotion to its teaching and adherence to its traditions, and on the other hand, the acute awareness of their weakness and backwardness as a people, culture, and society when compared to that of the West, despite their belief and the promise of the religion. The historic center of the Islamic civilization and the Muslim world is the Middle East, the area bounded by the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was an Arab. The Quran is in Arabic. And the imprint of Arabs on Muslim history is primary. But very early in this history, non-Arabs made their presence felt. And today, at the beginning of the century, Arabs amount to about a fifth or less than 20% of the global Muslim population. And the rest, that is the 4/5 or over 80% of the Muslim population, are Turks, Persians or Iranians, Afghans, South Asians, Malays, Indonesians, Central Asian, Chinese, Berbers, Africans of various ethnicities, and a growing number of European and North American Muslims through immigration, intermarriage, and conversion. Historically, Europe and the West have viewed Islam and Muslim as primarily Middle Eastern and Arab. And it is in the proximity of the Middle East and Europe, in the Arab conquests of land that were once predominantly Christians, in the wars of religion, the Crusades and jihad, in the complex relationship of trade and travel of Europeans and Muslims around the Mediterranean basin over centuries, that we have a history of engagement in war and peace between Europe as Christendom and Islam. At first, this contention between Christians and Muslims were more or less equal. And then, from about the beginning of the 17th century, a civilizational gap emerged between them that would eventually bring Europeans to conquer and rule practically the whole of the Muslim world, except for its most remote or backward regions, such as the interior of Arabia. It is in the central or the core region of the Muslim world, the Middle East, that there is the most intense sense of anti-West opposition, and which exploded in the second half of the last century. This opposition in the name of Islam carries with it grievances against the West of colonial imperial exploitation, division of territories, competition for control of natural resources, that is oil, and the Islamist rejection of the Western worldview as antithetical. I'm being given 5 minutes, so I'll try to wrap this up. There's the problem of discussing history. There was a time not so long ago when great many Muslim thinkers and political leaders accepted the civilizational renewal of the Muslim world required learning from the West and adopting the worldview of modern science and democracy. But in the second half of last century, the 20th century, that aspiration, or the wind behind that aspiration, was sucked out for a number of reasons. So I'm going to delete the discussion that I was getting into. The most important indicator of the wind sucked out of the idea of learning from the West came with military defeats of Muslim countries such as Egypt and Pakistan in their wars against Israel and India. Out of these circumstances grew the idea of the Islamist revolution as a counter-revolution against the West. The Islamist counter-revolution has been the response to the reformist efforts of Muslim modernists, and it is predicated upon the dogma that the Islamic worldview is fixed for all time and the reconstitution of the vanished glories of a pre-modern Islamic civilization is the religious duty of Muslims. Now, those Muslims who disagree are declared apostates and are being killed. That's what we are looking at. This brings me back to what might be understood, and I'll take just 2 minutes, so rest assured, I won't take up too much of your time. This brings me back to what might be understood as radicalization of Muslims, which then poses the terrorist threat in the West emanating from Muslim immigrant communities. The feeling of humiliation arising from an awareness of the backwardness of Islamic civilization that I have referred to. The Muslim youths caught between the culture of the West where they reside and the culture their parents' generation left behind are most affected by such feelings of humiliation. They're vulnerable to the politics of denial, to rejecting the argument that Muslim backwardness was largely self-inflicted, arising due to internal corruption, dynastic wars, tyranny of rulers, and the orthodoxy's inquisition against those who defended rational thought in matters of faith, politics, and knowledge. The politics of denial instead seeks to deflect responsibility away from Muslim failure to external factors, primarily Western imperialism, and view Muslims in history as docile victims of the enemies of Islam. The psychology of denial provides a false veneer of self-respect in terms of identity politics and feeds the politics of Muslim grievance and resentment against the West that Islamists exploit for their purpose. Muslim youth searching for their identity in the salad bowl of multiculturalism that the West, led by Canada, adopted as a policy are easy prey to the lure of Islamist ideology when infected by the psychology of denial and driven by the politics of resentment and grievance. From there onwards, it becomes a slippery slope to defending Islamism as the ideology of victimhood, to supporting the cause of Islamist jihad, and for some to become jihadists, head for hotspots of Islamist warfare, plot terrorism against infidels in the West, and seek martyrdom that will be rewarded in the hereafter in accordance with the Islamist ideology. This, in conclusion, is the sum total peril of Muslim radicalization as a global crisis and national challenge that Canada and the West confront. Canadians, non-Muslims, and Muslims together need to put their political correctness aside and understand the source of the problem of Muslim radicalization if they're going to successfully contend with the symptoms and effectively counter the terrorist threat. It begins with the understanding that Islamism is the ideology of jihad, of warfare, and that it should not be given the constitutional protection extended to religions, including Islam. Instead, its exponents and apologists should be exposed, denounced, and prosecuted for criminal offense if their speech and writings instigate violence, causing injury, death, and civil unrest. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mansur. I could have listened to that all day. I wish we had had more time because I really like how you underpinned it in historical circumstance. There's a lot of parallels, I think, to some of the other things we've seen throughout history. And I think it's really courageous for somebody to stand up and say these things in this particular time and space that we have. So thank you for your comments. I just was really impressed by them. Our next speaker is going to bring this down into the local context and what we're doing here in Calgary to look at issues around violent radicalism. But he also came with a partner, Staff Sergeant Clare Smart with the Calgary Police Service, who will be joining us on the panel later. And I just wanted to mention that she was one of the first police officers in Canada to participate in the International Police Peacekeeping Operations Program in Darfur, Sudan. She's also on the team that has been tasked with developing a redirect strategy, which is what Sergeant Paul Dunn is going to come and talk to you about now, and he's going to introduce himself, so I will leave it to him to tell us what Calgary Police Service is doing in connection with the community around these issues. Paul?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Sergeant Paul Dunn, and firstly, thank you to you guys for taking some time out of your busy work life or afternoon schedules to come out when the weather seems to have turned a little bit nicer for us from the last couple of days. They say never go second. It appears I did. I got left a tough act to follow with Dr. Mansur, especially as he rather sprightly leapt up onto the stage and off of the stage, which at 6'2" and 240 pounds, I am not attempting because I know that would go very wrong for me. I've been with the Calgary Police Service for approximately 14 years now, worked in a number of different areas. My current location is working within the Community and Youth Services section within the Calgary Police Service. And as stated, I'm currently working on a project called Redirect, which we are hoping to come to the public a little bit more about in the coming weeks and months. However, I'm going to touch on some of the thinking behind our Redirect program here today. So, before determining if we're facing a global crisis in radicalization, we need to have a clear definition of exactly what radicalism and radicalization is. Academia and governments alike have sought to provide definitions of these terms to assist people in understanding the term radicalization, and many of them are very similar. What confuses the public in general is the overuse and the misinterpretation of these terms, to the extent that many now believe that radicalization is a new phenomenon, and worse still, only an issue about Islamist-inspired extremism and terrorism. I would look to Dr. Peter Lear's definition of radicalism, which he describes as having a political, ideological views or endeavors which attempt to solve societal issues and problems down to minute detail, i.e., with utmost zeal and single-minded, uncompromising attitude. Being radical can be a positive attitude, and radical movements do not violate the principles of liberal democratic law. Additionally, I would turn to Angel Rabassa et al., who have defined radicalization as the process of adopting an extremist belief system, including the willingness to use, support, or facilitate violence as a method to effect societal change. Radicalization and extremist violence is not new to Canada or its history. Historically, we have dealt with nationalism in Quebec, Sikh extremism and terrorism, environmental extremism, and most recently, Islamist-inspired extremism. However, what is new to us is the pervasiveness with which it is reported to us and the apparent speed and dynamics of the radicalization process. There is no specific set pathway to radicalization, and it is a very individual and contextual process to the person and their location. However, there can be some identifiable similarities between individuals that are radicalized. Because each pathway is unique, it can also hinder law enforcement's abilities to detect those that are vulnerable to radicalization. The pathway from law-abiding citizen to extremist can be very fluid and progressive. And there are theoretical milestones in that trajectory. This pathway can contain many cognitive openings in a person's life that not only affect the radicalization process, but also provide opportunities for intervention and prevention. The great challenge for police and practitioners encountering violent extremism is that these pathways are usually really easy to identify after the fact with the benefit of hindsight, but are considerably harder to detect when they are happening because they are often out of or held in the wrong context. Globally, when we talk about radicalization, we are talking about a very small percentage of the population that are actively engaged. But they have the world's attention because of the impact that this small group can have on a larger audience. The Canadian government reports that approximately 130 Canadians have traveled to engage in extremism abroad, and that as many as 80 have returned to Canada for various reasons. Each of those people will have gone through a process of radicalization on a very individual basis. In contrast, if we compare the situation in Canada to Europe, you discover that 1,400 French citizens have traveled, the largest in Europe, and around 200 have returned. France also reports that as many as 900 are in transit or are seriously planning on traveling to conflict zones. Over 700 Germans have traveled, of which a third of them have returned, and the United Kingdom has seen over 700 leave and some 300 return. The challenge and concern is what have they learnt whilst they're away, and what are they prepared to do upon their return? As law enforcement, we have previously focused on mass casualty attacks perpetrated by organized cells. But the significant threat we now face is individual, lone wolf type attacks encouraged by an ideology such as those that we saw in our own country in late 2014. From a law enforcement perspective, the latter is incredibly difficult to detect prior to its execution, if not almost impossible. Without doubt, our primary focus at this time is on Islamist-inspired radicalization and extremism, and the events unfolding in countries such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and now in regions of Turkey. These conflicts involve groups that have almost become household names for us. ISIS, who I will refer to as Daesh, Jabhat al-Nusra, and al-Shabaab. But it is important that we remain focused and cognizant that radicalization can occur across a number of ideologies, causes, and groups. It may be nationalist, religio-political, straight political, or single issue such as animal rights or anti-abortion. This is evidenced in the comparison of Islamist extremism and far-right extremism and non-governmental extremism in the United States, where the latter is responsible for more than double the number of deaths than the former since 9/11. Calgary Police Service, whilst focusing on the primary threat, is remaining alert to all forms of radicalization and extremism. What has been unprecedented in the last few years is the sheer number of people that are becoming vulnerable to radicalization. And it has presented significant challenges at national and local levels. There are many causes that could be hypothesized as to why this has happened. a perfect storm of political and territorial conflict in regions of the Middle East, the rise of groups such as Daesh in the vacuum of those conflicts, and their near blitzkrieg-like level of occupation and control that they initially gained over the region, or the unprecedented access and use of social media that extremist groups, specifically Daesh, have employed targeting a demographic that have never known life without technology and were coming of age. Like never before, these groups have been able to spread their message of hatred directly into homes hundreds and thousands of kilometers from where they are. Accounts on social media such as Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat, to name a few, can be created faster than those companies can monitor them and shut them down. These groups often deliberately target vulnerable youth with their media, often changing the messaging to a specific audience. No longer do we see dry, long-winded ideologues from figures such as Osama bin Laden and Anwar al-Awlaki. Now we see fast, glitzy, short, and very impactful messaging that appeals greatly to our youth. Challenging is their ability to radicalize young women, exploiting their vulnerabilities and insecurities in somewhat the same manner that sexual predators have used the internet. Historically, radicalization often needed a local facilitator to cement ideas, but social media and the internet have removed that barrier, with young people able to directly communicate with extremists in theatre. On a local perspective, we have also been impacted by the increase in radicalization. In late 2012, we saw a group of men with varying levels of association to each other travel to the conflict in Syria and Iraq. By the end of 2014, they had all perished fighting for what they had come so strongly to believe in. We've also had a couple of convictions of offences related to passports of a couple who were suspected of making plans to travel to Syria. And we have also had incidents involving far-right groups that have attempted to disrupt peaceful, democratic, and lawful protests against such subjects as racism. There may be yet more in our community that have an intention to join an extremist group or are on a radicalization trajectory to extremism. What I can guarantee you is that those people in our community now, somebody is noticing a change in that person and their behavior. It may be family, friends, or co-workers, but they are noticing something that makes them uneasy, even if they cannot pinpoint what it is. The police have a role to play in the efforts of counter-radicalization and violent extremism, but we are not the sole solution to the problem. We often hear the claim that we must address root causes, and it is true that knowledge of those root causes can assist in understanding the ideology and the motivations of a group. But D.R. Kathakainen highlighted that addressing the root causes comes only secondary, as in all probability it may be a Herculean and sometimes even impossible task to reverse the course of history that has given birth to these root causes. One of the keys to the prevention of radicalization is building resilient communities. To do this, we need multidisciplinary approaches that involve all areas of the community and policing working in partnerships with each other to overcome challenges. The subject of radicalization may also require communities to have honest and difficult conversations about what is actually happening and why. It is okay that the citizens of Calgary have concern about what it may mean if we accept that radicalization is occurring in our city. But that concern cannot and should not be used as a barrier to actually addressing the issues at hand. We must be honest with ourselves. In keeping with the principles first laid down by Sir Robert Peel in 1829, the Calgary Police Service has a very strong commitment to prevention and intervention activities. With the use of our crime prevention and reduction continuum, we assign a significant number of resources to the prevention of crime before it occurs. The majority of these resources are housed within the Community and Youth Services section. We have a number of intervention programs that specifically worked with youth that are vulnerable to crime and gangs. Some of them involve police officers partnered with social workers from Calgary Neighbourhood Services. Those teams work with the family and the youth to remove those vulnerabilities and make the family and the community at large more resilient. The vulnerabilities that can cause a person to be involved in crime are not exactly replicated in radicalization, but there are some similarities. We are currently closely looking at how our existing programs can support and complement the community for those that are vulnerable from being drawn into radicalization as well. As the police, we understand that it can be incredibly difficult for somebody to report a concern about somebody else that they care about, and they worry about getting that person into trouble, especially if they're reporting it to the police. The police will always have a lawful obligation to investigate allegations of criminal acts. However, at the Calgary Police Service, we work with people and families on a daily basis who may have never committed an offense but are in some way vulnerable. In Calgary, our service has a unique ability to work with our community and access resources for people that has few peers in policing. If you have a concern about somebody and radicalization, please speak to somebody, whether that be family, friends, a community leader, a faith leader, and even have the courage and trust to speak to the police. We can make our community in Calgary resilient to radicalization, but we must work together and take a multidisciplinary approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergeant Dunn. It's great that, once again, the Calgary Police Service is leading the way in a program to address radicalization that I understand is unparalleled anywhere in Canada. So that's very exciting to me. I'm going to invite our panelists to come up on stage now with us, and Clare, you can join us as well. And then we'll open up questions to the audience. He's working on it. I would please encourage, somebody will be coming around with a mic so that we can hear your questions. She will maintain control of the mic. So I would ask you to keep your questions very concise and short so that we have enough time for everybody to get their comments in. So try to avoid any kind of long commentary. Just quick, short questions to the panel would be mostly appreciated. So I'll turn up that. Oh, they're live. Okay, so you can direct your questions to an individual member of the panel or to a general question to the panel. And if you're going on too long, I'll cut you off.
How many of the countries in the last 7 years which have been invaded by Western military do you know of that had IMF banks established prior to the invasion?
So, what we are confronted with is a world war going on. You know, the last century had 2 world wars, but if you want to put it in historical context, it was a European tribal warfare. The rest of the world got involved in it. We, are having a world war going on. This entire region, North Africa, Middle East, Central Asia. So there have been interventions because there are interests. If you want to understand the global picture, there are cause and effects. My point that I was trying to point out is the internal collapse of the Muslim world. It is an internal collapse. What happened in Europe was an internal collapse of a great civilization, Germany. So we cannot deal with these things. If you want to understand, the Western world did not create the problem. That is your ideological fix. That's what I was pointing out, that the Muslims who engage in this politics, they want to deflect the argument instead of taking responsibility of their history.
We have another question for you.
Hi, I didn't know this was going to become a debate about the whole problem. I actually have a question. I'm really happy about what the police force is doing, what I heard they're doing with youth and problem families. I just don't think it goes far enough. I think the problem is that we have so many young today that feel so displaced, so disconnected, don't know where to go, don't have a voice, and they're searching for a voice. And it's no different than back in the 60s and 70s when we had these religious cults that were taking over our youth and people were killing themselves in mass numbers. I think it's a disconnect in our society, and I'd like to know how we're addressing that issue. I heard from the police department how we're addressing that issue, but I think it has to be wider spread, and I believe that this is growing because of that disconnect right across the board.
Why don't you take that, Paul? Or Claire, either of you?
Yeah, I think because we can talk about like some of the programs that we have as an organization.
And again, I can only speak for the Calgary Police Service here in the programs that myself and Paul and several other members and partners are involved with. So when it comes to the youth, again, when it comes to radicalization, right now we have an enormous amount of youth programs, even stemming to the age, like it starts at age 5 for us, pre-criminal space, that the police, as well as our social workers, community and neighborhood services, Alberta Health, and several other agencies throughout Calgary. We have to work in collaboration now. That is the key. But the other thing is we can't do it alone, and we need those families. We need the community to come forward to say that they have started to see those differences. May not know what that is, but there's something going on that we or other agencies that we know of can help step in and try to give that youth, as well as the families. It's not just about the youth.
So are you working more with communities, like the individual community centers, the individual...
Yes, when it comes to our other programs, because we have a great foundation right now, we're not perfect. I get that, and we're still trying to work on that. But we do have a foundation, and it's working, and that is why we're building this redirect program on top of that, because we are fortunate that within Calgary and within our police service and the communities, we are working together to try and benefit these children and families. But when I also say those families, we're also looking at the children of, if that individual, let's say young boy, young girl, also has siblings, let's look at those siblings as well, not just that one individual. It's the family.
I was wondering if you can clarify what you had said earlier regarding a fourth of the population in the world is Muslim. GDP is at around 8% in those countries, developing countries. So sort of a politically correct situation. A lot of aid is going into these developing countries, regardless of the Muslims or Christians in these developing countries. A lot of this aid is going into the pockets of the politicians and not going to the people who actually need it. And then anything happens, they always blame the West for their problems. Rather than, I mean, if you look at Russia and Cuba and places like that where they've had revolutions internally to resolve their own problems. So my question is, how far do we go to resolve their problems? I mean, is all their poverty our problem? I mean, I know that initially, because of colonization and things like that, we caused these things. But at one point, you have to stand up and say, you know what? You have to address these problems yourselves. We're putting in billions of dollars. I mean, the Western world is putting billions of dollars, not just North America, but Europe, into these developing countries. The money is not going to the people, but yet we are blamed for their problems.
Thank you. I didn't get a question there, so I don't know what you would want him to respond to.
I'm sorry, so I guess my question is about, you know, the GDP. Are we responsible for that low GDP, the West? When you mentioned that, I was a bit confused as to what you were referring to.
Look, I mean, I pointed out the GDP. We can point out many other indices. It's not a question of responsibility. These are indicators of where the world is, and in this situation, where the Muslim world is. If we talk about that in the term, and I said that the Muslim world is not uniform. It is very vastly diverse, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, and so on. But the thing that connects them is the common belief. There is a Christian world that is vastly diverse. You know, what connects and makes the Christian world is the belief. So the Muslim world is vast. One indicator, or the macro indicator, is the reality of the Muslim world in terms of where they stand technologically, industrially, economically, and so on and so forth. The Muslim world is part of the third world. It is very poor. It is very backward. Those things have to be talked about. We have to understand it. But we are also living in the 21st century. It's a globalized world, and none of us can be insulated from the problems of a world where everyone is, as Marshall McLuhan talked, living in a global village. We are neighbors to each other. The Muslim world has collapsed. It is in an internal implosion. Part of that implosion is coming to us, that is, in Canada, in Europe, in North America. Our friends in the police force, their hands are cuffed because they have to operate within law. We don't know, our politicians and our leaders don't know how to deal with this global problem. What I was doing in my limited time was giving you a sort of a thumbnail sketch of a huge problem that we are confronting. There have been other times that we have confronted other problems. The Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution. The world of Islam today is posing a huge challenge, and we do not know how to deal with it while protecting our own systems of government, our own law and orders, with the immigration, with the floods of refugees, who are all part of the collapsing world of Islam. If you don't understand that, we cannot address the problem. That's what I was pointing out to you.
We have another question.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
So just to jump off Dr. Mansur, yeah, it's a very complex problem. And just to jump off what you just said, actually, that our governments don't really know how to respond to that. I'm saying, in your opinion, I'm just curious, do you think how Western and our government and how Western governments are responding to the collapse of Islam in the most beneficial way? Like, in your opinion, for example, like Canada is ramping up military involvement, and other countries are, and is that the best way? And you're admitting that a lot of the countries don't know how to respond to this, don't know how to respond to the radicalization or the collapse of Islam. What do you think, or just a short snip of what you think would be a more proactive or beneficial way to respond to the collapse of Islam? Or do you believe that Western culture is actually responding to the collapse of Islam in a proactive way?
Well, very quick and short answer. It's a thesis one could write about, but very quickly. You know, we, the Western world, is also on a learning curve in trying to deal with this problem. The quick and the short answer would be that we should build the resources to contain the problem in the Middle East. We did that. That is, the West did that collectively to contain communism. But now the generation have forgotten it. My students have no memory of what the Cold War was, what containment strategy was. At the end of the Second World War, that the West developed a strategy to contain communism, and for the next 50 years, we effectively followed the strategy till we see the result that happened in the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the change that the Soviet Union took. My answer, and as I've spoken about it and written about it, a similar containment strategy is required to contain the problems of the Muslim world. Now, the second part of it is, the problem has to be dealt with by the Muslims themselves. They have to solve the problem. The primary problem is an internal problem. As I was pointing out, in the limited time that we have, and I know the frustration that you feel, and the frustration I feel. Don't you think I feel the frustration? Because this answer cannot be given to you in a 90-second soundbite. The problem is an internal. As I said, it is the collapse of a worldview. You're dealing with the Muslim world, 1.7 billion people, say from Nigeria to, say, Malaysia. Immense diversity. Do you know that, for instance, Iraq, what upset me with these gentlemen and these silly questions about George Bush and so on. Iraq and the Arab oil-producing countries, give me the 90-second, please. If you take away the oil income, they don't produce a needle that can be exported. Where will the employment come from? I go to North Africa because I have family connection with North Africa. Algeria is an oil-producing country, gas-producing country, immensely rich in natural resources. But that's all that they produce. Where are the young people going to get work from? They don't produce a needle. There's an internal collapse. And the Muslims have to address that problem. And that problem cannot be addressed by deflecting it to saying that the problem was a Western problem. They exploited us. They did this to us. They did that to us. Nobody's going to pay attention to that. And so, slowly, the Muslim world is also developing the response to it. When you say what happened in Egypt, when you see that what General Sisi has done, he's taken on the challenge of destroying the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a 7th century ideology. We're dealing with an ideological struggle. That ideology has to be destroyed. If Hitler had been destroyed in 1929, we would not have had the Holocaust and 20 million dead in the Second World War.
It was funded by Bush.
So you can see, thank you. Thank you for your questions and the response. You can see that this is a really passionate topic, and I love to see people come out and share those ideas with emotion and passion. It's important that we continue the discussion. I'm just going to turn it over to Shireen from the Calgary Public Library to wrap us up. Thank you.
Hi, all. My name's Shireen Samuels. I sit on the board of the Calgary Public Library, and I'm thrilled to be here as a representative of the library as one of the sponsors of today's event. I've had two things bouncing around in my head this morning as I was preparing to come here and deliver closing remarks. One is a quote from Emma Lazarus, an American poet, that was paraphrased by Martin Luther King and Solomon Burke. Until we are all free, we are none of us free. And the other thing that's been bouncing around in my head was a meme that popped up on my Facebook page this morning. And it was a picture of a mushroom cloud, and the text attached to the picture was, Japan has been at peace with the US since August 9th, 1945. It's time we made peace with the Muslim world. It shocked me so deeply. And those two things have been whirling around in my head all morning. And as I was listening to the difficult, the pain-filled, the anger-filled, the sort of confusion-filled discourse that we've been engaging in here, they continue to resonate for me. I'm the child of South African immigrants, and I can say with certainty that this kind of kill them into submission rhetoric is found throughout human history. And it's rooted in many things that, have been touched on by our learned panelists today. It's rooted in geopolitics, religion, global poverty, marginalization, the globalization of social media, disenfranchised youth. It's rooted in all these things. And I believe that even deeper than all of that, it's rooted in fear of the unknown. It's rooted in fear of the other, them. And a condition that is found throughout human history is not going to be solved in any sort of permanent way. But our answer to that has to be to engage in the process of humanizing each other whenever we can and wherever we can. With all of the challenging, messy, hard to reconcile, passionate public discourse that is necessitated to create that humanization. So I would like to thank deeply the panelists and moderators who brought us such thought-provoking work for us to dig out and examine today. And I would like to thank you for bringing your own passions, your own thoughts, your willingness to critique the status quo, to critique the world in which we live and ask questions that are painful and difficult. I would like to thank, on a slightly lighter note, the Indonesian Kitchen for providing us with such a lovely lunch to fortify us for this great discussion today. And I would like to thank Global Fest for the opportunity provided to the Calgary Public Library to be a daily sponsor of today's forum session. This Human Rights Forum has been going on, as Anush mentioned, for several years, and these are some of the deepest and most profound issues that face us every year when the Human Rights Forum is held, and they are necessary, if sometimes painful, discussions to have. And lastly, I would like to thank the TD Bank for being such a stalwart sponsor of the Human Rights Forum overall, and I'd like to invite Derek Cresswell-Clough back to the stage for a final word. Thanks, Derek. Thank you all. You did the jump.
Well, thank you very much. I figured if Dr. Mansur could do it, I got to follow suit. After all, I put him up to it when he jumped up on the stage earlier, so thanks for being a good sport. And thanks to all of you. As a token of our appreciation today, I would like to recognize all of you and give all of you a little something from us at TD Bank. So I'll start with Sergeant Watt. If you would come forward, please. We have a little something for you. Oh, sorry, Smart. I mixed you up. Thank you so much for your contributions today and for taking the questions today. Thank you. I have something here for you. Yes, for you? Absolutely, I do. Of course. We come bearing gifts. Mr. Dunn, please come forward. Thank you so much for your speech today and for taking the questions as well. Well done. That was great. Yes. Is it free money? Yeah, he asked if it was free money. No, not this time. Dr. Mansur, thank you very much for your speech today and for taking the questions. I know things got a little bit heated today, but I was thinking of a quote as well when all of this was going on, and it was along the lines of something that Voltaire said, and that is that we may not disagree with one another's views, but we defend everybody's right to the death to say it. And so thanks for being a good sport as well, and and jumping on the stage too. That was really great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, well done. Thank you for having me. And Dr. Pruegger, thank you so much for moderating today. Great job today, and thanks for involving us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
I want my bag too.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Ooh.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for taking part today and for asking questions, coming out in the first place. And we hope to be able to do this with you again next year. With that, have a great afternoon and safe travels home. Good afternoon.